So welcome to the second event in the Ukrainian Talks that we've put together at Durham in collaboration with our new partner in Ukraine, Zaporizhzhia National University and Durham County Council. My name is Markian Prokopovych. I'm a historian based at Durham, working on the history of Central and Eastern Europe, and I will be chairing this event. So I wanted to begin by thanking everyone at all the three institutions for making today possible. As you've doubtless noticed, today's event is a hybrid one. So we have an audience here in this wonderful room, and we also have an online audience, people joining from all around the world, but many of them from Ukraine. So the war that's been going on has shed light on a number of issues, and sexual violence is one of them. And you know, obviously sexual violence is a problem of all societies, including this one, but in the context of war, it can be and has been in the past used as a tool, as a weapon, and there is evidence of this happening also in Ukraine. When I say this, I mean in particular acts of rape and sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian army in Ukraine during the ongoing conflict. So I think the first challenge and the first big question that we have is the question of distinction. To what extent what we are dealing with here, the society that is in the context of war, to what extent is it different from, you know, trying to tackle sexual violence, trying to help victims of sexual violence elsewhere in peaceful societies, like, for instance, in Britain. And, you know, is this even a relevant question? Because if you think about it, in some sense, the physical and the emotional harm that results from acts of sexual violence, you know, in an individual, in the victim's immediate circle, and maybe even a broader circle of acquaintances, you know, might not be that different, whether it is war or no war. But if it is being used as a tool, then it is part of a particular strategy, the aim of which is to inflict as much harm on as many people in a particular society, in a particular country as possible. And in that case, maybe there is a difference that we need to think about. There are, of course, all sorts of official reports. There is the Ukrainian Ombudsman, there is the Ministry of Interior, there is also the Prosecutor's Office, the UN has made its reports. There's a growing number of non-governmental organizations that deal with this issue. And the question here is really the reliability of numbers. To what extent, sometimes, you know, different numbers are being reported, to what extent these are reliable? Are we really dealing with just the tip of the iceberg? And, you know, can we at all establish the number of victims at all, ever, or, you know, today or later? There are other issues. There are issues like measurability. Things that we are going to discuss are very difficult to put in numbers. How do you measure the harm, the extent of harm that has resulted from a particular act of sexual violence or rape on a particular individual, or, you know, on how many people? How do you do that? But we need to perhaps think about these issues, even if this is not possible. Well, and finally, and this is why we are hoping to have lawyers today as well to talk to us about the legal issues. Now, how do you collect evidence? What evidence is acceptable? How do you bring perpetrators of sexual violence to justice? You know, all of these issues are also very difficult ones. So we have experts with us today. We have Natalia Mosol, who's an associate professor of psychology at Zaporizhzhia National University, joining us online. We're also expecting her colleague, Oleksii Makarenkov, a professor of law, also from the same institution. But as I'm sure you're aware, there are massive electricity cuts and internet cuts, so it might just not be possible for everyone to join us today. And we have two colleagues of mine, Towl, professor of forensic psychology, and Tammi Walker, principal of St. Cuthbert Society, and also professor of forensic psychology at Durham University. So since we are already a little delayed, can I just go on and ask Natalia first? Natalia, you're a psychologist and you've dealt with this topic for a number of years, but for the general audience, especially for the audience here in the UK, could you tell us, what the situation actually is on the ground?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Good evening to everybody. Yes, because we have difficulties with connection. So can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
so can I also share some slides as well?
Yes, please.
Okay. So just speaking about the issue of war and violence, I want to say that I will speak as scientist, psychologist, and also as Ukrainian, because yes, this topic is a difficult one, but also I would say has personal meaning, because speaking about the situation in Ukraine, just a second, I will. When we speak about different stories, yeah, there are some stories we can hear from our clients, for example, speaking as psychologists, and some stories we can read about or can hear from the relatives of the witnesses. So there are so many stories, and of course, some of them are not revealed yet. And for example, most Ukrainians, they know name Bucha. This is the place, I think many of you heard Bucha too. The place where the mass killing of Ukrainians by Russian army forces was revealed, and also the place where many cases of sexual violence were revealed as well. And actually, when people were asked, they said many women, they were held for days and they were raped, boys, girls, even old people, and even soldiers who were carrying Viagra. So it was really like a military strategy. So yes, we can say that sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. And I would say that it does influence not only those who suffer from the violence, but also the whole society. Because when you read about this, you feel like sometimes you feel guilty because you couldn't somehow protect those people. Some people, they can feel fear because it really like weapon, yeah, that is being used. And actually, speaking about the topic, sometimes we have survivors of the violence. They don't want to speak about their experience because it's very, really such a trauma. And also sometimes we have people who don't want to listen to such topics. So again, I want to say thank you for being here, the part of this discussion, and for participating in this event, because it's very important to speak about this and, to bring this issue to the light, because it should be, there should be some responses and action that should be done. And again, if we speak about numbers, for now, only 124 cases that were confirmed. And those cases was confirmed by the UN. It's about rape and sexual violence. And again, it's from since the military invasion on February 24th of this year. But we can say the exact number is unknown. It's not only about 9 months of the war. Actually, it's about 9 years of the war, because it started actually not in this year. For us, it started in 2014. Yeah, and so no exact numbers and actually no investigation somehow. And now we know that there are some more vulnerable groups like women, girls and boys trapped in areas with ongoing military operations. They are at high risk. Like women supported the Ukrainian responses like soldiers and health workers, or sometimes Ukrainian women who try to escape and to migrants, mostly those women and children, so also at risk of sexual violence and trafficking. And sometimes we say, yes, it's very difficult to identify, investigate those cases because it's the most hidden crime. People don't have physical ability to report. Sometimes people feel guilty or they feel ashamed to report. And we don't really know the numbers. Yeah, we can guess that their number is too large, actually. And we still have some territories with the ongoing conflict, and so we don't know the numbers. We just know that the problem exists. And speaking about psychological aspects, we can say that this is one of the most disturbing form of trauma. This is really the trauma that have the most lasting impact. And of course, psychologists and psychotherapy, they do help to overcome traumatic experience. Yeah, we have special methods and so far, but many people, they don't come to see psychologists or psychotherapists. Many people, they don't even come to see some medical advice or legal assistance. And we really know that people who survived violence should also seek the advice of medical professionals, or also deal with and have some legal assistance. This is very important also to know about such cases. And I also want to add that in Ukraine, we have some state organization structures, but we have also many non-government organizations, and they try to help really. And those would be like Ukrainian, for example, Ukrainian network of women affected by violence. It was even before the war. And some organizations, they are really working geographically, like, for example, youth organization in Kharkiv, or some very good organization like Women's Perspective in Lviv. So it's really important to coordinate the action of specialists and coordinate responders, and to look for specific answers, because this is really a huge problem that should be responded. And it not only affects the survivors or those who suffered from the violence, but it really have the influence and on the whole society, on everybody who knows about this. So again, thank you for your participating in this discussion. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia. It is indeed very, these are the issues that have already been addressed at the previous event we've had within this talk about moral costs of war. We also talked precisely about the feelings of guilt or shame. Now, these are again occurring in this context. Natalia, can I just ask you one more short question, if you could? Could you, from your experience, what do you think is the biggest challenge of helping victims of sexual violence in Ukraine right now?
I would say that many victims, they are from the territory with still ongoing like fighting, bombing. So we don't even have access to those victims. And for example, those who survived, they try the first, what they want to be, it's to find safety. So actually, only when they find safety, and I know that many prefer to go from Ukraine because for them it's unsafe to stay here. So I know that, for example, many survivors and there are many psychological help that is provided outside of Ukraine. So it's really, to actually to find and to help, you need to have the person, and it's not the easy way for them to come and to ask for the help.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tammi.
Thank you, Markian. So, so me and Graham are going to do this part of the presentation together and dipping in and out. So, we've got a slightly different take on this. So I'm Professor Tammi Walker, and we've got Professor Graham Towl coming in, and we're looking about from a perspective of how best we can help victims and survivors of sexual violence in war. And so the idea is that we're going to talk a little bit about the scoping of the problem, but then really look at the nuts and bolts of about a public health-based approach. And what we mean by a public health-based approach is very much about a focus on health, safety and well-being of the entire population. And it's really about maximising the benefit for the largest number of people. So as you can see from the slide, it's about looking at the wider communities. It's looking about them individuals who don't feel capacity to report. So it's non-reporting victims and survivors, but also looking then at those who do report and how we can support them as well. So it's looking at the entire process of that community in general. And then we'll have a concluding slide as well. So just think about the scoping of the problem. War crimes such as sexual violence impact on victim survivors, so these are the primary victims, and their families and the wider community, which we would class as the secondary victims. Many such war crimes will go unreported, as we've already heard from Natalia, even to close friends and family as well. So it's not just about the services and the psychologists and the psychotherapists. Even those individuals who are very, very close to them, they will not feel comfortable for a variety of reasons about reporting that to family and friends. And we know that from previous experience in other war situations, that there's a number of levels of barriers to reporting. This can be down to individual feelings of humiliation and shame, not wanting to reveal the actual experience, and the feelings of helplessness, as well as feelings of hopelessness. And there's also feelings that they will be little point, because at the end of the day, no one is likely to be held account for the actual incidents which has happened in terms of the sexual violence. So what is the point, from their perspective possibly, of putting them through that process when they know that nothing's going to be supported in terms of that as well? I'm going to pass you over to Graham now, who's going to talk about the public health-based approaches.
Thanks very much. Right, yeah, I'm Graham Towl, Professor of Forensic Psychology at Durham University. I was formerly Chief Psychologist at the Ministry of Justice. I've worked as a psychologist with survivors of sexual violence and also perpetrators of sexual violence in the past too. So to start off with, looking at the wider communities, both Natalia and Tammi have mentioned that the victims, survivors here are one really central and important part of this in terms of our understanding of this area, but also looking at wider community impacts too seems to us to be very important, fundamental here. So the importance of that is that we need different strategies for different groups. So in a sense, we need a different strategy at a broader community level to maybe a strategy which would cover victim survivors who've not felt able for whatever reason, and there can be very good reasons for people not wishing to report that group. And then the third group, which is those who have directly experienced been subjected to sexual violence, but do feel able to report. And as Natalia and Tammi were alluding to, these will always be a relatively small sample of the numbers of people who've actually been subjected to that. So, looking at the wider community, I mean, we would expect that the wider community would feel, a sense of anger, perhaps a sense of shame, perhaps a sense of humiliation, and as Natalia was saying, I think, is even feelings of guilt, for maybe not having intervened, even though they couldn't really, in practical terms, intervene, of course. But it doesn't stop people feeling guilt about having not intervened, thinking, well, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that, or whatever. And we touch upon these areas because psychologically, this is some of the territory we'd anticipate covering if we were working with individuals who'd had those experiences. And again, anxiety, depression, a feeling of helplessness too is quite key, a sort of learned helplessness. What can we do about this difficult problem? So I think the recognition of that is really very important. and challenging the need for self-blame. People have just not been able to stop maybe their loved ones being subjected to sexual assault, and that's a very difficult thing for people sometimes to come to terms to in wider communities. But I think recognising that is very important, that it's a whole community thing. So, as Tammi was saying, these are some of the secondary victims in that sense. So then moving on to what would be quite a substantial group, which would be the non-reporting victim survivors. So again, and this has parallels elsewhere in terms of our understanding of sexual violence, wherever it's occurring, in a sense that there'll generally be a much larger group who have not felt able to come forward and report. And sometimes people will report, but sometime after the event. There'll be many more people who report quite some time after the event than shortly after the event or at the time of the event itself. So with this group, to reach out to this group, we think public health campaigns are very important in terms of, for example, letting people be aware of specialist sexual health assessment and treatment centres. So some of the things that people could get there is, for example, blood tests for sexually transmitted infections, those sorts of things. Someone doesn't have to say, I've been subjected to sexual violence, to get some of the basic physical health interventions that they may need. This is really important, that we don't want someone to have to feel they have to report before they can get service. So if we offer this service to everyone, then that seems to be a way of destigmatizing that and putting the onus on us as a community to recognise that it's a shared issue for us to try and address. And respecting the victims' survivors is really important at different levels, but their sense of personal agency is really important, because someone's had their sense of agency taken away from them. So psychologically, it's very important to try and do anything that we can to restore, rebuild that. We need to recognise that there'll be an inflated risk of suicide. There may be post-traumatic stress disorder problems, and this will be amongst those individuals who've maybe not reported. It might be amongst those individuals who have reported too. We need to be aware that we would predict that there would be higher rates of suicidality, higher rates of post-traumatic stress and so on. And again, sometimes people come forward for support and they don't say what they think the cause of the post-traumatic stress is. They'll simply say, I'm not sleeping, I'm feeling very anxious, and so on. So I think encouraging people to come forward about their feelings rather than targeting what's happened to them, but actually talking about how they are in terms of what their feelings are. And finally, the public health-based approach needs to focus on the victim survivors who do come forward and report. And there, I think one of the key things is about believing people. Often people say, oh, I don't want to come forward, I don't think anyone would believe me. That's a very common phenomena. One of the key therapeutic goals there is to instill hope in individuals. That if someone comes through the door and discloses something, believing them and instilling hope for change is really quite crucial. We need to leave that room being aware that there is hope for the future, and that other people have survived that, and that they can survive that, and we can help them with that. And some of their interventions are educational, sort of informing people about what's a normal range of responses. Sometimes people say, oh, I think I'm going mad, or I think, and so, well, no, you're not going mad, you've just had a very, it's the situation which is mad in a sense, not you. It didn't mean it's what's happened to you that is, as it were, unusual. It's not your response to it, it's a usual response. And then helping people with practical issues is important too. And then there's other things that are done sometimes. We feel like forming victim survivor groups, joint support groups, and so on. So there's a whole raft of things. I've just touched upon some of those today, just before I hand back, if I may, to my colleague Tammi.
So that's just to give a flavour of the kind of approach that we want to come from, with it being like for the public health-based approach. But as you can gather from that, what we're trying to suggest is that different groups will need different approaches, as we've outlined there. But within them groups, individuals will also, their own individual needs within them groups will differ too. So it's important that we need to recognise choices to reporting from victims and survivors. They need to be in control because they had that control taken away from them. And it's about, they need to be in control of who hears their story and what support they accept. So it's very much from the individual perspective that we're coming from in terms of all of this. And what Graham and I believe is that a public health-based approach recognises this. It recognises that there's a range of victims and survivors with a range of responses needed, as we've just briefly outlined above as well. We've also put on here just a few aspects of further reading which can all be accessed by anybody because they're open access documents, so anybody can download these. So you don't need to be linked to an institution of any kind as well. But they just give you some understanding of the kind of treatments and preventions which could be, which could be provided for gender-based violence with survivors in the Ukraine. These are all this year in terms of papers. They're all 2022, and then from the Lancet. So you can download these if you want as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tammi, before we move on, can I maybe ask one question that just been bothering me while I was listening to Natalia and both of you? I was just thinking, okay, these are very interesting, look like very helpful suggestions, but is there something based on your knowledge of other contexts that you work with, is there something in the Ukrainian context that appears, unusual, that we should be taking into account, particularly in this specific case? Or is it just another case of brutal war with very similar problems that we know from other contexts?
Well, I think Natalia may be best placed to talk to some specifics about Ukraine, but certainly in terms of what we know about sexual violence as a war crime, as a tool of war, there's quite a lot of learning across cultures and so on in that and across different wars, which I'd say is over and above sexual violence in peacetime. But the fundamentals are much the same, would be my perspective on it, I think. But as I said, I defer to Natalia in terms of knowing the specifics of Ukraine.
Natalia, what do you think? Would you agree with Graham on
Yes,
this?
I would say, yeah, because you always have something general, but we also have this specific, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move on. Oleksii, can I move on and ask you a question then? As a lawyer, now, Tammi and Graham already talked about hope. Now, one aspect of hope is bringing perpetrators to justice. Now, what, in your experience, what are the challenges actually in achieving that?
Dear Professor Markian, dear colleagues, I am glad to join to your meeting. I am prepared a piece of a very short presentation and could share, if you let me, via this device. Thank you. One moment. I try to explain or maybe touch 2 points. At first, it seems that we have very optimistic statement from the most influenced and powerful person, like Prime Minister of United Kingdom, current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who during visiting our capital outlined that we should to provide rule of law and committed and punishment to punish all criminals who committed crimes in our territory during the war, and many other meetings and statements from high responsible person like prosecutor for all countries in Europe, like Germany, and from France, Czech Republic, Polish Republic, and other. And for lawyers, it's very important because these statements, whole statements, it's a good ground for further legal documents. Like we could see that when the war was started in 2014, we immediately received reaction from General Assembly of United Nations when leads of the states recognize that it's illegal intrusion of Russia Federation in our territory. And more remarkable, it's a decision of European Court of Human Rights. Among other facts, in this decision of 20, which was adopted 2021, we could find facts which were revealed, established by and approved by European Court. For example, it's a statement which touch administrative practice of enforced disappearance of people and the lack of effective investigation, and that Russia Federation also provided administrative practice of cruel treatment and other violation of human rights, and other statements if we analyze this decision. It's very important documents for Ukrainian for future investigate, including different investigation in criminal court, International Criminal Court of United Nations. If we try to very briefly analyze other important documents, legal documents, it's a judgment of International Court of Justice of 16th of March this year, United Nations resolution, which permitted, according to this resolution, was created Human Rights Council Commission. I'm sorry. United Human Rights Council established the Independent International Commission to investigate Russia war crimes in Ukraine. And which is interesting that according to the report of this commission, which was dated of just a moment, and try to find appropriate slide. It's reported of this commission was ready to the 18th of October this year, and according to this report, we could see that was established that Russian military committed war crimes in Ukraine, violated human rights and norms of international humanitarian law. For example, many awful cases described in paragraphs 88 till 98 of chapter 5, sexual and gender-based violence of the report, and it's really terrific and awful experience for and of our citizens. For example, we could see that as for today, up to 70 crimes have been recorded among the victims. You can see that more than 800 children were injured and more than 400 children were killed. But as for facts of sexual crimes, only 43 criminal proceedings have been initiated to date. Simultaneously, what's important that it is not possible to determine the number of crimes in the occupied territory and place of hostilities. Investigating cases related to sexual and gender-based violence is a complex task. Victim face obstacle in the process of reporting such violation. Due to the current security situation and forced displacement, victims have difficulty assessing appropriate medical care, physical support, and law enforcement in a timely manner. Also, it is not always possible to document the fact of rape and full extent of the injuries received by the victims with the help of forensic medical examination. The next slide informed us about some peculiarities of detection and investigation of sexual crimes in the deoccupied territory, which carried out by specialized police groups. They include specialists who previously worked with the case of domestic violence, juvenile police officer, investigator, prosecutors, psychologists. Among the facts that have already been recorded by the law enforcement agencies, there are also gang rapes and rape of minors. The peculiarity of the investigation of this type of crimes is that the victims are not always ready to tell what they experience. For these reasons, a large proportion of such crimes remain hidden from prosecution. In peacetime, about 30% of victims reported sexual violence in Ukraine, and in wartime, this percentage is even lower. These facts from Prosecutor Office of Ukraine and Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. According to the report of the United Commission, we could see that these facts, such facts, is illegal deprivation of liberty was often preceded by execution, sexual violence. The armed forces of the Russian Federation conducted long interrogations that sometimes lasted for days and were accompanied by sexual violence also. Victims also described acts of forced exposure for extended period of time in front of others, amount to sexual assault. This commission also described a case when 4-year-old girl heard her mother screams as she was raped in the next room. Such acts also amount to torture, also evaluated as torture. The age of the victims is from 4 to over 80 years old. Criminals raped women and girls in their homes or took them and raped them in unoccupied apartment. If we try to move more faster, we also I also want to stress that the Commission also received reports for that some servicemen of armed forces of Russian Federation helped people escape from the to commit sexual violence. So we could state that not each soldiers from Russia Federation Army is a criminal person. I want to join from experience of my grandmother when she described period occupied our territory by Germany, Nazists, and she mentioned that in her village state military who didn't committed any crimes, and it's a good correlation with statements of this commission that also army forces of Russia Federation also was different. Thanks for God, not each of them is criminals. So if we try to conclude it, it seems that our country needed forensic support from our partners, equipment for conducting forensic examination, storage of numerous evidence, specialists who know how to identify victims of sexual violence and convince them of the need to record the crimes committed again, bring the perpetrators to justice, professional assistance for emotional support of victims of these types of crime and their full psychological recovery, further expansion of the capabilities of platforms for gathering evidence of war crimes, which we, for instance, we have such platforms in our sites of General Prosecutor Office or General Prosecutor Office of Ukraine. It seems that cooperation of Ukrainian police officers and the other representatives of law enforcement agencies, prosecuting judges with the Ukrainian partners to share experience in the investigation of war crimes and relevant organization support is also necessary. So it's the main point which I wanted to outline. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Oleksii. It's difficult to kind of move beyond the sheer horror that comes out of these, of those numbers and those cases. But I think we do have one specific example why numbers matter. One thing that I noted for myself is that there were over 69,000 cases recorded, and only 43 of them were the cases of sexual violence. And I think there's something to think about there. There's a massive discrepancy between these numbers there, and obviously reveals that there is perhaps still a stigma and all sorts of other things that we have already mentioned.